Koa, we are thrilled to have you. And I'm sure everybody's aware of this, but we really have to shout out Koa Beck for her critically acclaimed nonfiction book, White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind, praised by feminist writers Gloria Steinem and Rebecca Traister. Previously, Koa was the editor-in-chief of Jezebel, the executive editor of Vogue.com, and the senior features editor at marieclaire.com. She currently lives in Los Angeles, California with her wife, and we are so thrilled to have Koa here with us this evening. And without further ado, I pass the virtual mic over to Koa.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Feely for again hosting this for all of us so that we can be together. And thank you everyone for coming to listen to me speak, to learn more about this subject matter. I am extremely passionate about this research. And I was just telling the team, one of the silver linings, I guess you could say, to our highly digitized, white collar space now is that we can do events like this that are free and open to the public. And so many people can come and discuss material like this together. I have really enjoyed through book tour and promotion of this book, being able to do events like this that are internationally open, available to everybody, particularly students. So as I was introduced, my career has primarily been in mainstream women's media. I have covered a lot of cultural topics as they pertain to women and non-binary people, specifically, things like the wage gap, sexual harassment, Me Too, I covered extensively, as well as, other things like structural inequality, a lot of queer rights, a lot to do with Black rights in this country, identity politics, that sort of thing. I came up through more, say, like social justice-y avenues in press, rather than say like fashion or beauty. A lot of times when people see my resume, the assumption is that, I came up through like fashion reporting, and that's not true. I oversaw fashion teams, I oversaw beauty coverage, but that is not my lane in terms of reporting. I oversaw that digital strategy. So thank you so much for coming to this presentation on white feminism. I have a lot that I want to share with you. Everything that I am sharing with you today is cited in my book. So if you see something that is very intriguing to you, literally I can message you the page number that it is on if you want more, details about anything that I am saying or you're unclear on a definition. I'm going to ask that you hold questions until the end, just because the way that I have structured this presentation is that a lot of what I start with, I then follow up with. So if you have a question on something, I might get to it, 2-3 slides down the line. And without further ado, let's go. So I think it's really important for the purposes of this talk that when you hear a term like white feminism, we all get on the same page as to what that even is, what I'm even talking about when I use a term like that. Part of what incentivized me to write this book in the first place is that white feminism started to be a word that I was hearing a lot. This would be around like 2017 or so. I was starting to see it a lot in like discourse and, essays and things like that, and definitely, social media, but I wasn't coming up against a very concrete definition of what that is or what we're actually talking about when we use a word like that. So for the purposes of my book and laying out, the origins of this ideology, this is the definition that I settled on and that I explain and cite in detail in my book. I'm sure you can find, maybe some other definitions that are a little different than mine, but this is the one we're going to be working with tonight. So I define white feminism as a very specific approach to achieving gender equality. And to be clear, it can be advocated by anyone of any racial background, any class, any orientation, any gender presentation. It is an ideology and a practice. It pulls considerably from imperialism, capitalism, labor exploitation, and specifically white supremacy, which makes it very unique from, as we'll see further in the presentation, different forms of feminism and different approaches to gender inequality. One of its benchmarks is that it prioritizes and speaks to the individual as a feminist. So other, movements and feminisms that we'll get to later on, they really speak to the collective. They speak in terms of, collective body of women or non-binary people who are being oppressed. They think and advocate and use language that's more pluralized and incentivizes more of a unity and community. Specific detail that sets white feminism apart is that it asks you to look inward and to think of yourself first, and to really understand feminist consciousness through an individualized understanding of yourself and your gender. It also, its biggest hallmark is that it exports and advocates a very specific skill set to navigate patriarchy rather than dismantle it. So I have many examples of this in my book, but if you think in terms of like, hacks or, like lifestyle tips or like different things that can be used to automate things, you as a marginalized gender are asked to optimize your life and to optimize the very, unique circumstances of your household or your job to basically overcome patriarchy. Many other feminisms are not like that, and they do not try and furnish you with a skill set to get ahead. They're more interested in rethinking the structure by which marginalized genders live. So here is some important data that I think we should all see and understand for the purposes of this talk. So when you see, in the news and, in many publications that I worked for, many sort of, overall bird's eye view of gender and gender progress, you'll probably encounter data like this. This is data that I used to report on and see a lot in my job. And it's presented to you as being, a lot of times, feminist data. This is how we're understanding women and women's progress. So women-owned businesses grew 21% between 2014 and 2019, arguably a good thing. 50% of these businesses were women of color owned. In my book, I go into more detail about this, but Black women owned most of these companies. And a recurring trend for the last 4 decades now is that most college graduates are women. And that is, as far as I've looked as of like 2019, pre-pandemic, that's still on the incline. So a lot of this data that I'm presenting to you here, this is how we are asked to understand gender progress and feminist wins. Now, to contrast, here's something else to consider. Here's everyone else. So people who are not business owners, people who, not necessarily went to college, although some of them did. Between 1980 and 2015, Black women narrowed the wage gap with white men by 9 cents. I'm in my mid-30s, so this is roughly my entire lifetime. 9 cents has been all that has happened in terms of closing that gap. Latinas have narrowed the wage gap even more narrowly by 5 cents in 35 years. Meanwhile, in my lifetime, the number of imprisoned women in this country has grown 750%. So this data I give to you as a very sharp contrast to the first page in terms of this is data that really affects a lot of marginalized genders. And when we're talking about gender progress, it's important that the data that be presented not just be about women who went to college, women who started their own businesses, women who are, singularly very wealthy, women who have assumed classes, because what I'm presenting you with right here, this is actually most marginalized genders in this country. And when you're thinking about feminist and feminist progress, this data belongs absolutely alongside those other benchmarks that I just presented to you. So here are some very key hallmarks of white feminism. And in this presentation, I really want to give you tools to, one, be able to identify feminism in real time, but also understand a lot of the ideology surrounding it. So some key hallmarks of white feminism, how you know that white feminism is arguably in the room with you, whether you're with your friends, you're with colleagues, you're at some sort of like community planning event. Always cis men are used as the template for equality. And I'll get into the origins of why this is in a couple more slides, but essentially you'll see this a lot with, men have run companies a certain way. They have had, very abysmal workplace policies. You'll see this a lot with, punitive measures, or even on top of that, like just sort of the aspiration of, how women should be running certain things. So if men are the template for equality, and historically, I looked at this a lot for my book, if they run companies a certain way with exploitative work practices, if they don't have, say, like any sort of parental leave policies, if they have, spoken in an extremely punitive way to somebody, if they have harassed somebody, and then a woman comes up and does the exact same thing and is a female CEO, a big hallmark of white feminism is like, well, the man does it that way and he doesn't get punished for it. Feminism for many marginalized genders in this country has explicitly not been about mimicking the power structure or practices of cis men. In fact, it's about envisioning a system of equality well outside of that. So I'll get to that next. Another big hallmark of white feminism is that you are asked to pay for your feminism. So for many other groups in this country, feminism has been not about a transaction. It's not been about me paying a couple $100s to go to a really exclusive like conference or to get a mug that says feminist on it. Feminism has been about challenging power. It's been about standing in front of a very powerful structure and demanding equal pay, about having safe work environment, about standing up to harassment with other women, about, being food secure, access to clean water. It's often been, if we're thinking in terms of like an empowerment, right? It has been that rush that floods in from challenging power. It hasn't been a ticket you buy or, a very commercialized transaction. But in white feminism, it often is. I'll get to some more examples about that. And another big hallmark of white feminism is you are asked to aspire to whiteness and not equal rights. And what that means when I say that is that for many other feminist movements that are not governed or, aspire to a white feminist ideology, it's about everybody in their community having access to affordable meat, everybody in their community having access to local education, every woman at the company having the ability to work without being sexually preyed upon. Whereas for a lot of white feminist narratives, you are being asked to aspire to white privilege. So you are ascending classes, you are procuring more wealth, you are becoming a CEO and the head of the company. You're having a very individualized ascension to privilege, not equal rights for everybody who's working class, everybody who's poor, everybody who's queer. So the place where a lot of this starts, and I anchor my book here very, very intentionally to show you the origins and foundation of white feminism, is it really begins, to my assessment, with white middle to upper class suffragists in this country. Now, to be clear, there were many suffragists in the United States, women who supported the right to vote, who were not white or middle to upper class. There were Black suffragists, there were Indigenous suffragists, but these specific women, the ones who were white and middle to upper class, they had a real hand in shaping what is now referred to by many as first wave feminism, specifically around the right to vote in the United States. And they took a real departure from, say, like the women's movements that came, 30 years earlier, where they really wanted to embrace power rather than rethink it. We're going to get to this in the next slide, but they took on a real commercialized approach to suffrage. They really wanted to popularize the notion of suffrage through, signs, merchandise, things like that. But they also let it be known that they envisioned equality for white women in very, very specific ways. And I would argue, having, reviewed a lot of historical texts for my book, very differently than, say, like the Black suffragists or the Indigenous suffragists. They viewed equality for white women based on the power and autonomy of their husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers. And you see this play out today, right? They explicitly were looking at their husbands who were, leaving the home every day, voting, participating in democracy, owning companies, having, sort of like legal claim. They looked at that as specifically something that they wanted to mimic, and they saw that as the template for their own equality. Having said that, they saw the vote as a way to assume power. Other women's groups, and I get into this in much more detail in my book, many that were, working class or immigrant, they saw the platform of the vote as a way to change institutions, as a way to make sure that, poor women and working class women were treated fairly and employed in a way that, respected their humanity. These specific ladies, white middle to upper class suffragists, they saw it just as an ascent to power, not necessarily equal rights for all women, but power for themselves. And I make the argument in my book, citing the work of many other feminist historians and theorists, that to me, this really laid the groundwork for conflating power with equality. And I've seen this a lot in my career in, what some people refer to as the fourth wave of white feminism, although that's contested, where, having power, assuming the head of a company, being the, breadwinner of your family, that is how equality is conceived of. So another really important thing to keep in mind with the white middle to upper class suffragists is that they were up against a very challenging PR dilemma, shall we say, when they were embarking on popularizing the right to vote. essentially, much like it is today, women who spoke publicly, women who were not anchored by the home, women who had opinions that differed from that of their husbands, these were considered, deviant, shrill women who were not following gender protocols, who were, trying to become a man and vote, and were heckled, not listened to, harassed. It's kind of like being a woman on Twitter now. And so the suffragists decided that they wanted to battle this misogyny by executing a very large PR campaign telling you what a suffragist was before you could generate all these like really nasty misogynistic opinions and images of, who this like, man hater was. And this is like pre-1960s. So the way that they decided to do this was, and I have a lot more data about this in my book, they literally sat down and crafted an image of who a suffragette was and who you were supposed to think of when you thought of women's rights. Not surprisingly, they went with a pretty white supremacist image. The woman you were supposed to think of when you thought of women's rights, she was white, she was thin, she was conventionally feminine, she was able-bodied, she aspired to be married, she aspired to be a mother, and she was young, and she had money that she wanted to spend. She wasn't, challenging what gender was. In a lot of ways, there was some paternalism being executed here, and that, for many like older men, right, who didn't believe women should have the right to vote, some of these suffragists were clearly trying to appeal to like, oh, this could be your daughter. This could be, the girl next door who you've watched grow up. She's very demure. She wants to do what you want her to do. She's not challenging or upsetting structure or family. She's also very pretty to look at. And so for white middle-class suffragists of this era, this really cemented that, they were communicating to the nation that as suffragists, they were not trying to expand the definition of what a woman was or who a woman who wanted the vote was. They were communicating to the nation very cleanly that they shared ideas, in some ways, kind of conservative ideas, very limiting ideas about who a woman was. And so across all kinds of archival materials, which I have here, but there are many, many others, you see the same woman depicted again, very tall, very thin, very young, very, middle class or aspiring to be middle class. In many materials that I looked at for my book, you see like a very young woman, like sheltering a baby, from a storm to suggest to you that like, don't worry, she still wants to have kids. She still wants to be somebody's mom. Key things to think about, and this continued to play out beyond, the suffragist era, is that white feminism as an ideology and a practice never attempted to rethink labor. And this happens again and again. I document in my book how this happens now, also how it happened in, what some people call the second wave. White feminism as an ideology did not rethink domestic labor. It didn't rethink low wage labor. It didn't rethink any sort of exploitative labor. The ideology advocated that women participate in these channels, again, as cis men always have. And yet, we'll get to it later, many, many, many other feminisms, labor is a big part of their politics. Who executes it, what their rights are, how much they get paid. And, if they can have bathroom breaks, if they can have bosses who are not predatory towards them and do not abuse them. There was a key moment in circa the 1920s where the middle to upper class white suffragists did try and create common ground with more working class women and immigrant women. So the women who worked in like the factories and the laundries, the women who had just come to this country from like Poland and many other nations who didn't make much money, but labor turned out to be something that they could not agree on as two women-centric groups that advocated for suffrage, in that, the white feminists wanted to be their husbands. They wanted to be essentially ascend to be these patriarchs who owned these big companies with, understandably, a lot of these, low-income women doing all the labor for very, very little money. And a key point that, these working class feminists really raised again and again with these more like lofty suffrage groups is that if you want to be your husband and you want to own this big business empire, you will, in a sense, be exploiting me at some point. And the point I make in my book is that, 4 successive waves of white feminism have essentially said that that's okay. So as I alluded to earlier, white feminism around the 1920s really embraced commercialism. Along with that PR campaign of, we will get together and homogenize who a suffragette is. They also wanted to popularize the idea of votes for women, literally with stuff. So I document and, explain a lot in my book about how around the time that women's suffrage was actually being presented as a platform, at the same time, many boutiques and department stores, which were endorsed by suffrage organizations, made votes for women flags and pins and sashes and luggage tags and hats. There was an official suffrage outfit, which was in, many sort of like window displays in New York City. Macy's was deemed the headquarters for suffrage supplies. So really pioneering this idea that if you were for women's suffrage and you were a woman, you would show your allegiance to that cause by buying these items. You would buy the Votes for Women flags, you would buy the pins, you would have these sort of like teacups all around your house. And this still plays out today. I mean, if you think about, probably a lot of spaces you've walked through or seen, or, stores you've been into, the whole like future is female sort of mugs, nevertheless she persisted, sweatshirts and t-shirts, feminist AF keychains. This is not new. This is actually a very, very old and enduring white feminist practice. And something I do want to be sure to say here, I'll go into a little more detail about this in a different slide, but I think something that gets really kind of lost in this conversation is that for, a lot of these items, right, in a capitalist framework, the idea is that if you have money to spend on things like this, you purchase things to exemplify what you believe, right? That is kind of how capitalism works. So, for instance, right, like I really like the color pink. So I make the choice to buy a pink water bottle, which I carry with me because I have a preference for the color. I think that these items exist along the same continuum. The place where it gets really thorny is that I don't think that buying a future is female mug should be conflated with advocating for parental leave. Just because you want to purchase something and have it, I don't think that necessarily should be conflated as a quote unquote feminist act. And this is a place where white feminism goes in one real clean direction and many other feminisms go in another. So another real benchmark of white feminism that I found in my research for my book is very consistent, is that white feminism often publicly aligns with famous and glamorous women. And this is very consistent. On the left of my screen, you will see Mary Pickford. I go into some detail about her in my book very early. She's a very interesting figure. She was an actress, a producer, a screenwriter. Later, she became a studio executive and co-founded a major influential company actually with Charlie Chaplin. She was one of the first women to be billed by her name in cinema, which was very rare at the time. I make the argument in my book that, Mary Pickford really set the template for, when you hear a name like Jennifer Lawrence or Julia Roberts and you see their face and you can think of their films that they did in the last 5 years and you remember what they were wearing on the red carpet and how they style their hair. Mary Pickford set the template for that. She was really the first woman in cinema known for her iconic ringlet curls. And she was very influential. She was very powerful in film, specifically in terms of all the hats that she wore and her understanding of the film industry, but also she understood herself as, what we would now call as a brand. She understood very cleanly from a business perspective that when she showed up to endorse something, it would carry her name in a very influential way. So Mary Pickford was a huge supporter of women's suffrage. And this is a professional photograph that was taken of her around 1913. And the middle to upper class white suffragists were really, really keen to have her support and to, in a lot of ways, use her optically as this very like aspirational feminist figure. Here's somebody who's very young and white and glamorous and well-respected. And when you think of suffrage, you're supposed to think of somebody like Mary Pickford, somebody who's very powerful, who commands a lot of respect, and who a lot of women want to be. Similarly now, circa 2015, here you have these gorgeous models. I'll get into a little more detail about the future as female, but it very similarly plays out today, looking at very gorgeous, glamorous, wealthy, influential women who are young, and sort of propagating them as the face of certain feminist causes, or, you know, being a visible representation of feminism in some respects. So that is something that has carried through from the first wave to now. So here are some white feminist practices that I want you to be aware of in real time. These are things that, like a lot in this presentation, I go into a lot of detail on in my book in terms of analyzing, you know, where they come from and also how they operate specifically in my own career, things that I have seen. A key white feminist practice is that it asks women and non-binary people to aspire to be seen. So what I mean when I say that is that, you know, if you are a domestic worker who, you know, wants like a basic wage that's a living wage, and you want healthcare for your work, white feminism does not see you. Having said that, if you're a domestic worker and you want to like start a newsletter or like run a business or create, you know, some sort of empire, white feminism absolutely does see you and wants you to be there and will furnish you with resources. But white feminism does not meet marginalized genders where they are in terms of their financial circumstances, socioeconomic, gender presentation, a number of other factors. White feminism also, its signature is that it aligns feminist principles with profitability. So I've seen this a lot in my career in that, you know, I've spoken on a lot of panels about gender progress, feminism, Me Too, wage gap, lack of, you know, women in like high profile roles. And something that I see a lot that is a big red flag to me in terms of, you know, white feminist discussions is that money is framed as the threshold by which women are valuable. So I go into detail in this in my book, but for a while there was a big study that was whipped out a lot on panels that was like, oh, you know, if you have like X number of women on your board, your, you know, revenue goes up this much percent. If you have like this many women in leadership positions, your revenue, you know, goes up this much. If you actually have a, you know, parental leave that is accessible to the women in your company, you will basically save this much money by not having so much turnover. The reason why that is a white feminist practice is that many other feminisms aren't looking to align the value of human life with money, and capitalism often can like stunt this conversation and make it more about, you know, companies making sure that they meet their bottom lines rather than, you know, women being able to breastfeed on the job or, you know, actually being able to spend time with their babies, not meeting, again, once again, women and non-binary people where they are. White feminism also doesn't challenge structural power, and I found this to be very consistent in my research for my book. You know, whether we're talking about now or the second wave or the first, it really encourages marginalized genders to excel within the present system, to excel within capitalism, to like get to the head of the, you know, company, to get to the C-suite, to get to the top of this department. A place where I've seen a lot of this drop off in my own lifetime, and even when I looked back on, you know, some historical records that I looked at, is that it encourages women to take up the politics of power without really rethinking it. So, you know, once you get to the C-suite, then what? You know, are you going to run this company in the same way that, you know, the really misogynistic man before you did run it, you know, in terms of paying people very minimally, you know, not rethinking any sort of family leave policies. And again, getting back to that profitability, feminism for, you know, many groups in this country is not profitable. And that's not what they're chasing. In fact, many feminist and gender movements in this country see profits and feminism as being actually oil and water, incapable of working together. But white feminism often tries to merge these ideas. It also asks that you look inward rather than those around you. And I go into really granular detail about this in my book because I had to consume and oversee a lot of white feminist narratives of, you know, really famous women or, you know, gender movements or products or businesses. And consistently across all of them, you're not supposed to look to the other women, you know, in your company or your community or your neighborhood, other parents that may have experienced similar things. You're supposed to just focus on yourself. What do you need? What, you know, sort of like interview tips can you use to make sure that you're paid fairly? Chances chances are, if you're a marginalized gender and you're not being paid as much as the cis man that you're working with, you are not the only woman, non-binary person who has been underpaid in that situation. There's probably a lot of women and non-binary people who are not being paid adequately. This is what I would define as peak white feminism, and really weaves together, the white feminist ideology and practice of the last 100 years, is really upholding one person for achieving an anomalous status and making them the feminist standard that all marginalized genders must aspire to. I cite a lot of celebrity profiles in my book, specifically how, a very young woman who's like 25 years old and in a power suit and, comes from a middle-class family and is like cisgendered, she is what the feminist movement needs right now. They need someone like her. Whereas, for many marginalized genders in this country, they don't come from middle-class backgrounds. They didn't go to college. They may not, have come from a home with two parents. They may not present in a conventionally feminine way. And this other attribution is from my book. And when my book published, this line really seemed to resonate with a lot of people, and it got like parroted back to me a lot, and I got tagged a lot. So I wanted to share it all with you because it really seems to exemplify this for people. I write that a domestic worker may never be a CEO, and that shouldn't hinder her ability to live above the poverty line. And I really urge you to think about that when you see these sort of like peak white feminist narratives. Most marginalized genders in this country are trying to achieve basic need. And yet the white feminist narrative now or 100 years ago is often about power and luxury and, getting to the top of a certain wealthy company. It's not necessarily about, having affordable housing. So here's what I was referencing earlier in terms of feminist movements that are not white feminist in their ideology and practice. A piece of not really a piece, but a construction of my book that I'm very, very proud of is that, while I have drawn you in with white feminism and give you a working definition of what it is and the research of it and how I see it play out, both from my own perspective, but also across history and time, I'm able to teach you so much about other feminist movements in this country. White feminism has done a very good job of positioning itself as like the feminism, capital T. That is not true. There have been many movements in this country that are feminist identified, and to be clear, they are not reactionary to white feminism. White feminism did not come first. A lot of times they came first. They have their own, ideas, often anchored in their culture and their circumstances and their oppression, about what gender equality is and what it could be. I include many in my book, Indigenous movements, queer and trans movements, Black, Latinx, working class, immigrant, disabled, Jewish, and fat feminist movements as well. They are the most exhilarating parts of my book for me personally to research and share with you. But some threads that I have found through all of them, particularly in writing this book, is that once again, they aren't about one woman in their community, right? Ascending classes or having some lofty job or, being able to sell like a really cool product. And then all the other women in the community trying to be like her. Many of these movements that are cited on the right, they're about everybody having access to clean water, education, food security, workplace protections, affordable housing. They are advocating for rights specifically as working class people, as poor people, as queer people. They're not looking to assimilate and try and be something that they're not in order to achieve, again, a basic standard of living. Also, many of these groups, historically as well as today, they're not trying to sell you anything. They don't want you to come to their conference, that costs a couple $100. They don't necessarily want to give you, a tote bag that says like feminist AF on it. They are, however, very interested in challenging power. They're interested in disrupting hierarchies and envisioning a more equitable distribution of resources. And so across many other feminisms, these are some important, I think, threads that really differentiate them from the white feminist ideology. Here are some ways to control for white feminism. And I hear this a lot, particularly on social, for readers of my book who, have had to walk through like feminist identified clubs or book clubs or communities, that again, use that word. And yet when, some readers of my book have been to these spaces, myself included, it starts to dawn on them that this is a very white feminist space and that we're not actually talking about, again, affordable housing, food security. Ways to control for this in the spaces that you navigate, especially, within your community, digitally or otherwise. I have found that if you really start at basic need and anchor your feminist consciousness there. Again, clean water, food security, affordable housing, healthcare access, incarceration reform. Pretty much you are starting at a tier that white feminism does not operate from. White feminism as an ideology and a practice has often started specifically at really lofty educational opportunities and small business and enterprise, because all those other needs that I just listed are met. And that's why a lot of those groups often start there. But if you start, again, in terms of basic need, you're often controlling for that right away. Also, I would urge that you orient yourself against systems rather than individual people. I go into way more detail about this in my book, but a very specific small business owner, right, who cannot furnish you with paid parental leave, who doesn't have the resources to necessarily let people leave at 5. I don't think that's something she necessarily should be blamed for as far as a highly critical level. Our country lacks a lot of the foundations that make this possible in other countries. It's consistently outrageous that we do not have paid parental leave in this country. We are one of only a handful of nations that does. And the fact that, we don't have universal childcare, for instance. So I think being aware of systems of exploitation rather than going after individual people is a necessary framework for actually understanding the scope of power. Also, I would advocate that you support and work with public institutions. A place where I've noticed white feminism can often swoop in and really change conversations and change barriers is when everything gets privatized. A really elite club where you have to swipe a membership card. But if you work, with libraries, parks, public schools, things like that, you're starting from a resource that is allegedly for everybody. And so it can, in a lot of ways, obliterate some of those boundaries that, white feminism puts up, often incentivized by money. Now, if you are on this call and, you are very influential at your job or you are a business owner, I really erected this slide specifically for you. I have had a lot of very senior positions. I've been up against executive teams. I've had to answer to boards. So a lot of, what I have advocated in my book and a lot of, what I've spoken to you about today aren't things that boards want to hear. And that is the very unique position that I feel like, many women on this call who have positions like that, who have visibility like that, you are in a very unique place in terms of dispelling white feminism from these spaces. What I would advise first is that you either start a union in your company or you work with a union. Through the last stretch of my career in women's media, I stepped down to do this book, but I found that working with a union was extremely helpful in terms of getting very significant things for my team. I include a lot of union history and politics and my own experience with unions in the book that I highly recommend you review if you're interested in doing that. Unions are able to pull off all kinds of things that, as a very well-intentioned singular manager, are often not in a position to do. I remember at, jobs I had earlier when I wasn't quite as senior, but was starting to manage people, my only strategy was to go in and sort of puff myself up very big and just say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to ask the team to work this weekend after having worked, last weekend covering the Emmys. It's just too much. But, when I was finally working with a union, when I was being confronted with asks like that, it gave me more leverage to say okay, well, let me, confirm with the union and I will get back to you. It's really supportive for you. Also, when you start making structural changes, like I'm about to go over in this slide, working with a union helps protect your job. Because, as many of us know, and again, I go into more detail about this in my book, but it's if you start coming in, especially as a woman, and changing too much, not doing things as the cis man before you did, the board will just fire you. And they have all sorts of, ways to make that happen in a way that, looks legit and will not necessarily betray that, you were rocking the boat too much. So a union can help protect your job as well. I would also advocate that you manage board expectations. This is very tricky and hard to do, especially given that, for instance, so many tech companies and media companies, right? It's the explosive growth that people want, but without a doubt, it is that explosive growth in which you're making so much money a certain quarter, you're growing an exponential amount, where exploiting people does happen very, very organically. And so by managing the expectations of the board and saying what, that growth while, saying to yourself, I could do that, it would require that, I ask women who have just had babies to come back earlier. It would demand that, some of the younger people on my team who are not paid very much work several weekends in a row. That's how that happens. So if you can sort of like contain growth, it puts you in a better position to not be exploiting people. Also, with respect to the fact that roles are ephemeral, people leave jobs all the time, while you're in the senior leadership position, propose policy changes that will outlast you. Because again, you could do something or advocate for something that the board or the executive team or anyone above you, your manager, deems problematic. And then, they may not want you there anymore. But if you're able to get some sort of policy in place that is not necessarily stapled to you, that ensures that the people at this company might be better cared for and might be less likely to be exploited in the event that you leave and you move on with your life and get a new position. I also advocate removing really arbitrary resume barriers. And I've done this a lot in, outlets I worked for and hired for. Something in my career that has really bothered me is, newsrooms year in, year out are very, very white. And so diversity is something that like I hear a lot, but like I don't really see. And yet, when I would look at like job postings or outreach for a certain role, the job description and requirements would all read very, very specific. You needed to go to this fancy school. You needed to have like an arbitrary number of years of experience in, a certain like lane or, specific outlet. And, I come from the digital space. So, 3 years in a digital newsroom can easily translate to like 12 on a print magazine. So some of these things, people who are single mothers, people who are working class, people who are trans, they're not necessarily going to have resumes that look like the white middle class people who you have in your company. And so if you're actually looking to attract quote unquote diverse talent, that means that you cannot ask for the same things because our resources in this country are not equal. They're not going to have gone necessarily to those schools. Something that I really like to close with and that I really like to end on and leave you with is this incredible quote by Anne Braden, who is an author and anti-racist activist. And I include this quote in my book. She was an incredible anti-racist thinker. She was a Southern woman. She was white. She was from Alabama, and she was feminist identified and really advocated on behalf of civil rights and also Black lives. Circa like the 50s, 60s is when she really became well known, but she really did this work her entire life. She wrote, "In every age, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, there have been those who struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the thing that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed." I think it's important that I leave you with that for two reasons. One, in my career and spaces that I've been in with white feminist ideology and practices, when I have pushed for different types of stories to be told, when I've pushed for, hirings of certain people, a lot of times what I have been told structurally and by, my manager is like, well, this is all that's possible. This is the best we can do. We're not perfect. This really isn't the time for this right now. Things like that are really kind of placeholders. And I think it's important that when you're talking about anti-racism or, feminism or, any sort of rethinking of social channels, we are pushing for something that we have never seen. And that is the point, that we are pushing beyond possibility. We are, as Anne Braden said, envisioning a world that has never existed. And I hope that in your own navigation of white feminism, when you inevitably come up against these, boundaries, you are reminded of this, because we are pursuing something that we have never seen in a lot of respects. Weekends, once upon a time, were something that was like considered really outlandish. Women having access to birth control without permission to their husbands, that was also perceived as like a really outlandish thing that could never happen. Queer people getting married, like myself, that was something that people said would never happen. So it's important that you know that. And also, Anne Braden is very significant. I go into a lot of detail about this. She was part of a very important history of anti-racist white women in the South. And I bring them up very intentionally in my book. Anne Braden is one of a few that I go into detail on, and that she is a tremendous example historically and currently of a feminist who happened to be white, but was not a white feminist in her practice. She was not advocating that you aspire to whiteness in her feminism. And so that is all. That is the conclusion of my presentation. I want to make sure that I have enough time for questions. So at this point, if you have any and want to pop them into the chat, I would be happy to answer them.
That was amazing, Koa. Thank you so much. Like, just bravo. So many interesting references, things that I've learned from your presentation that I might not have understood prior. So very insightful. And if anybody has questions, please do not be shy. There's no wrong questions to be asked. Feel free to drop them in the chat box now. And thank you so much, Koa.
Of course. Thank you again for the invitation. And I always make sure to say, if you are interested in understanding this ideology and, my book, you can get it, wherever you decide to get books, but please do not forget that she is available at the library. You can get her for free. I also, if you are learning disabled, if you are dyslexic, if books are just, not how you consume information, I read the audiobook as well, which was a very fun, unique experience for me. I had never done that before. So please keep that in mind. You do not need money to have access to my scholarship.
Thank you. While we're waiting for questions to come in from our attendees, I have a question for you, actually.
Sure.
Was there a pivotal moment or a kind of breakdown to breakthrough point that you felt called to write this book? Was there any particular moment, or how when did it feel right for you to get this information out there, and maybe why? What drove that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy you asked that. So when I was the editor-in-chief of Jezebel, it was 2017. So to put this into context, the first Women's March had happened. Trump was president. And when I started at Jez, Me Too had just happened. And so I was on a lot of panels, usually at universities, sometimes other places, talking about harassment, misconduct, like exploitation of genders, but also just like power and how that works, when you are a marginalized gender in a workplace. Literally things I had been covering my entire career were suddenly like new, like in the culture and in the discourse. And something I noticed whenever I would do these talks is that every time I spoke, regardless of the subject matter, there would be a young person usually who would raise their hand and ask me directly about white feminism. And they would use that word. And often what they would relay to me, in front of an audience was that, they had gone to Women's March with their friends or their colleagues, or, they had gone to like this feminist book club. They had gone to, very specific feminist sanctioned spaces. And yet, when they were at these events or in these spaces, they felt a real disconnect with the other women that they were there in terms of, whatever feminism meant to them, and then what it meant to the person asking the question. And I always wanted to convey to that person that, while that's very hurtful and personally upsetting, it's not unique to you. There is a whole history of that exact dynamic where, you're talking about going to a Black Lives Matter protest, and your other feminist identified colleagues, are actually only going to go to Women's March, and they're not going to go to any of the immigration ban marches. They're not going to go and support incarceration reform, things like that. And so that really incentivized me. I kept getting that question, and I saw this sort of urgent need to, one, have a understanding of how white feminism works, but also the history, and to understand what was happening to you from a historical lens. I see some questions here that I can get to. CV has asked me, why don't you call this white supremacist feminism, which is more of an ideology than an identity category, as in parallel to socialist feminism? What is the value added of using identity category labels instead of worldviews/political perspectives to describe different types of feminism? I think that's a really good question. I decided to call this book White Feminism, even though I, walk through a lot of like what some people call like corporate feminism is a word I use a lot. Barbara Smith, an incredible Black lesbian feminist thinker, she cited in my book, she says bourgeois feminism. Some people call it girl boss feminism. I really wanted to call it white feminism to underscore the aspiration to whiteness, which I think is what merges a lot of these ideologies and practices together. I also think that white supremacist feminism. I mean, I get into a lot of white supremacy in the book, but white supremacist feminism, I think, leans more, they might drop the feminism word, but that leans more like right wing than what I'm trying to get to. My critique is of liberal feminism. I have friends who cover, journalists who cover like white supremacy and sort of like the women in the white nationalist movement, but that's not my lane. Next question is from Sabrina. I'd love to better understand how you define white, quote, specifically. Is this women from multi-generational families who came to the US from specific European countries? That's a really good question too. I define it in my book as a very specific, like normative middle class existence that aspires to like very specific commercially sanctioned milestones. So as I said at the top of my talk, there are many examples in my book of, you know, say like very prominent Latina actresses, right? Who I deem as aspiring, you know, to a very white feminist lifestyle and who export, you know, a lot of white feminist values. And I see it sometimes in like queer circles as well, you know, this very type of like heteronormative, you know, presentation of gender or like femininity. I would say we're talking about a aspiration to whiteness, which can fall a lot of different places depending on like your class or your orientation or your race to a certain extent. And here's another one. Robin, my question is a little off topic maybe. I've heard that suffragette was a pejorative term used to demean suffragists. Do you know if that's true? And if so, did you use the term suffragette in your title on purpose to critique those white feminist women? Sorry, this is much less important than everything you talked and wrote about. I don't think it is, Robin. Yes, I am aware of that. I use in my book suffragette and suffragist interchangeably. Suffragette originated as a term that was supposed to belittle suffragists, but, you know, like a lot of politics, you know, across different identities, it was reclaimed and sort of like used as a point of pride. But more importantly, I think for my book, in terms of my research and how narratives of suffragists are, you know, presented now, suffragette is the more colloquial shorthand that is used. And so I wanted to use that in an effort to make the subtitle, you know, very accessible, but also like concurrent with people's understanding of suffrage and who they think about. Robin has one more question. I'm also curious if you have any thoughts about the many books coming out now about white feminism. Not specifically, no. I think the only thing I would say is that I think that there should be a lot of books about white feminism and not just one. We, you know, don't have one definitive book on racism or, you know, classism or homophobia. I think this is something that warrants a lot of study and that a lot of different people, depending on their experience or where they are, you know, in the world, have an experience with, but also a perspective on. So I think we should have a lot of books on white feminism. I think we're at time. Exactly.
Thank you so much, Koa. This was absolutely incredible. Everyone, please make sure you are following Koa Beck on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. If you would like to further connect with Koa, we're happy to facilitate that for you through the Feely community. And we thank you all so much for being here tonight with us. And Koa, thank you for your time. We greatly appreciate you. You are incredible and brilliant. And thank you for taking the time to do this with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you again for hosting and for the invitation. Thank you everybody for coming, and I'll see you online.
Wonderful. Bye. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.